This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're going to discuss the recent history of the civil war in Syria. And this is a topic that deserves attention in its own right because of the importance of this country, the atrocities committed, and the lingering effects. But we're not only going to talk about what happened in Syria and what continues to happen in Syria, but the effects of that civil war and the violence, in particular the Russian intervention in that civil war, and its influence upon the war in Ukraine right now. The ways in which events in Syria are, in some ways, a preview to what we're all watching in Ukraine, and the ways in which the experiences in Syria have influenced the Russian military and other actors in the terrible war that we're all witnessing in Ukraine. That began about 5 weeks ago with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're joined by, I think, the person who knows more about what is happening in Syria than almost any other scholar in the United States. She's also one of the most interesting and exciting writers on foreign policy and international affairs today. And if you haven't learned about her work before, you should look it up. Her name is Emily Whalen. And Emily, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for that very generous introduction and for having me.
Well, I've only just begun to introduce you, Emily. Emily is a historian of U.S. foreign policy and of the Middle East. She earned her PhD in history at the University of Texas at Austin. I had the great fortune of being her PhD advisor, but I often felt she was my PhD advisor. In fact, she's now a postdoctoral fellow at our fantastic Clements Center for National Security. She's also been an Ernest May Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She has been a Smith Richardson Foundation pre-doctoral fellow at Yale's International Security Studies program. And she's been affiliated, and this is probably most relevant for our discussion today, with American University's of Beirut's Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. Emily has worked as a historical consultant for the East-West Institute, which is an international non-governmental think tank specializing in Track 2 diplomacy. And her writing appears in many publications. Her book manuscript, which will be out soon, we hope, is The Lebanese Wars, really the first major international history of these wars, at least written in English. And that's something we're all looking forward to. Before we turn to our discussion with Emily, we have, of course, Mr. Zachary Suri's poem for us today. What is the title of your poem, Zachary?
Shadows at the Door.
Let's learn about the shadows.
Where is it that the killers learn to kill while we're sleeping in the quiet of a windowsill? And while we wait in dreams of snow, they are in the icy street. And when we're late and knocking on the door, they trace faces in the sleet that were once, but are no more. I'd like to think that they are haunted when their rifling is done, and they wait on a cold porch and watch the rivers run. Inside, behind them in this stifling light, someone cooks them dinner and reads to them at night. But they are seeing faces in the shadows at the door, and we are there in suits and laces, prancing on the floor. So hold it tight, don't let it go, for even in the desert, sometimes there is snow. And sometimes even in the cavern, with a lantern and just a plum, sometimes there is justice, often there is some. Where is it then the killers learn to kill so cold? In the streets of your city, they have overturned the stones. They have opened all the sewers just outside your door. And here, in our town, we're already buried because we've seen it all before.
Zachary, you might have outdone yourself this week.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
What is your poem about?
My poem is really about trying to understand the psychology of war, more specifically the soldiers, the mercenaries who go from one conflict zone, from one war zone to another, and really how they live with themselves, but also the devastating trauma and death that they leave behind.
Well, I think that's a perfect spot to turn to Emily.
Mm.
There's clearly been a lot of death and destruction and trauma in Syria and in surrounding areas for at least the last decade. But maybe if we could start around 2015, how should we understand
Yeah.
what happened in Syria beginning around that time?
Yeah. Well, I will focus mostly, of course, post 2015, but I think it's worth reiterating that, war broke out in Syria in 2011 in conjunction with a lot of other popular protest movements in the Middle East at the time. The war was begun by the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, because the protesters were really calling more for government reforms, and he was the one who really saw this as an existential threat to his regime. So the war broke out in his resistance to any kind of political reform, and it continued on. It was pretty touch and go for the Assad regime, I think, all the way up until probably about 2014, 2015. And 2015 is when when Putin and the Russian military began the Russian mission in Syria. The mission in Syria was sort of nominally a mission to conduct airstrikes against ISIL. So this is the Islamic State in the Levant, and that, which you and your listeners may remember, was sort of a version or a sect of ISIS, which was the sort of extremist terrorist organization that sprang up in Iraq around the same time. So we have, the Russian military, again, this is sort of a nominally an airstrike mission. It's still remains nominally an airstrike mission, but by about 2016, it's pretty clear from reports on the ground that there are Russian troops in Syria. And in particular, in addition to Russian troops, there's also a pretty significant presence from Russian mercenaries like the Wagner Group, and that they are conducting pretty robust operations on behalf of the Assad government. So what I would say the two kind of key features of the Russian military mission in Syria were its brutality and the distortion of truth that went alongside it. And I can talk a little bit about that some more, or I don't know if you want to, if you have any questions about anything I've laid out so far.
No, yeah. I have so many questions, and I'm so glad you're with us to help us understand this. But, well, for many of us, even those of us who follow these issues closely, Emily, it's very hard to know what's going on because obviously there's a lot happening. Mm-hmm. And most of us don't have the language skills and the historical background in that region that you have. So in terms of the brutality, I mean, many outside observers are accustomed, unfortunately, to watching images of brutal military conflicts of one kind or another in the Middle East. Yeah. What made the Russian intervention particularly brutal for you to single it out that way?
Sure thing. And I would actually add to what you just said, where it's hard to know what's going on. That is actually a tactic of war. So it's not just it's hard to know what's going on, not simply because it's, people are a little bit accustomed to seeing violent images coming out of the Middle East and because of the language barrier, but because that is a deliberate tactic specifically by the Russian regime to make it hard to know what's going on, and the Syrian regime as well. So what I would say in terms of brutality, there is a Russian general, Alexander Dvornikov. I'm probably butchering that name.
No, that was good. That was good.
Yeah. So he led the beginnings of the Russian mission, and what I would say distinguished the brutality were, tactics and some of the material that were used. So you have thermobaric weapons, which people often confuse with white phosphorus bombs. Thermobaric weapons are much more brutal and much sort of hotter. and you have the use of cluster munitions and things like that. So things that go against the Geneva Conventions of War, and then also what they were targeting. So again, this is nominally, the Russian regime and the Assad regime are claiming that these are strikes against extremist terrorist factions like ISIL, like the Al-Nusra Front, which there were in the opposition some extremist terrorist factions. But they're blending those missions against these terrorist organizations with strikes against civilian targets. So hitting things like schools, hitting things like hospitals. They're pioneering, or I don't know if pioneering is the right word, but they're really using what's called a double tap strike, which is when you hit a target and then wait for, you wait for the emergency personnel and volunteers to come in to try to take people out of rubble or to tend to people's wounds, and then you hit it again. So you're hitting people who are trying to help others. So that's the kind of brutality that we're talking about in Syria, and this was pioneered by General Dvornikov in Syria in 2015, 2016, and has continued since he has left the command of the Syrian mission.
I hate to make such a apocalyptic analogy almost, but how should we understand the logic of the Russian presence in the Middle East? Is it similar in some ways then to the Nazi involvement in the Spanish Civil War as a sort of practice round for Russian expansion, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know that that's a terrible. I think that's not a terrible comparison. I think, historically, Russia has been an ally for the Assad regime. And I want to be careful here to emphasize the Assad regime is not the same thing as Syria. There are many Syrians who do not support Assad, quite a few. And it's really been, the Assads came to power in around 1970 and were historically really supported by the Soviet Union. So there is a long history here, and it's a history that has its roots in that Soviet moment that we also know is so evocative for Putin and so important to his psychology. So I think that there's a sense of Russian support of Syria as kind of almost an imperial legacy, if that makes sense, that this is sort of a moment when the Soviet Union had a great deal of power and they were sort of seen as equals to the United States on the world stage. And so by reinforcing his support for the Assads, Putin is really enacting his vision of what Russian power is going to look like in the world. Does that make sense?
I think so. Thank you.
And Emily, it's striking what you just explained so brilliantly. Putin claims in both this Middle Eastern space and then, of course, in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, he claims he's preserving Russian civilization. But what you've described is really extreme destruction, which includes not only mass death, but the destruction of economies, the rendering of resources and wealth unusable in many cases. So what is the logic of that?
The logic of the material destruction. I mean, I think that you can look at. I think I want to add another sort of element of destruction in there, which is the destruction of trust. So the double traps, the double tap strikes that I talked about, and then also when you are creating an environment that is quite literally almost unlivable, people become focused on survival, and you cannot focus on things like your political rights, on altruism, on the things that make us human. You're simply focused on covering sort of what Walter Benjamin and other philosophers call mere life, your bare life, your sort of animal basic needs for surviving. And in destroying an environment in which people can flourish and be sort of full human beings, Putin sort of reinforces, and Assad as well, this is something that the Assad regime supports, reinforces people's dependency on the regime for basics like security and keeping themselves safe. Never mind that the regime is the greatest threat to their safety, but when you make people afraid and you destroy social trust, then they're easier to control.
Right, and they're forced to cling to the very source of their suffering, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that extends, by the way, beyond the borders. This is not a specifically Russian philosophy. This is not a specifically Syrian philosophy, right? As Zach mentioned, there is historical antecedents to this. This is something that extends beyond borders. I mentioned that one of the signature features of the Russian campaign in Syria has been, an almost industrial strength disinformation campaign. So this is something that the Russians, tested out in Syria starting around 2013 and really culminating in 2015, 2016 in advance of their, disinformation campaigns and their involvement in the U.S. Elections in 2016. You started to see when the Russians got involved in Syria, sort of a lot of allegations about particular groups like the White Helmets, which is a group of Syrian volunteers who would go in. They were very important in exposing the war crimes of the Assad regime. They were also emergency services. A lot of them died in these double trap strikes I'm describing. But there was a coordinated campaign, online campaign, implying that they were linked with Al Qaeda, and that story came out of Russia. And it was one of the first times we've seen this really, like I said, industrial strength disinformation campaign. So spreading that mistrust beyond the borders of Syria and Russia has also been a part of this.
So it's not only destroying people, cities, resources, it's destroying any semblance of truth.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And what about the use of chemical weapons, which was in the news for a short while and then again was almost forgotten?
Yeah. So this was sort of the first, I would say, kind of moment when we started to see Russia take a more robust stance in Syria. It was in 2013 that the exposure of Assad's use of chemical weapons in certain suburbs of Damascus was sort of broadcast to the world. The reaction was pretty immediate, and there was a sort of universal condemnation, but there wasn't much done beyond that. And one of the there was a lot of conversation from the Obama administration about potentially becoming more involved in Syria. There was a lot of domestic resistance to that. And the solution that was kind of struck upon was by Sergei Lavrov, the then Russian foreign minister, I believe, was that Russia would help coordinate, would sort of act as Syria's guarantor and help coordinate the removal of the chemical weapons by the Assad regime's chemical weapons in coordination with the United Nations and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And they did this. They conducted these operations in September 2013, starting in September 2013 into October 2013. And for what we know, most of the chemical weapons were removed and destroyed. Significantly, though, I would say that there were certain sort of ingredients of other chemical weapons that were not covered in this agreement. So there has been evidence of the Assad regime's continued use of chemical weapons since this moment. But I think I see that moment in 2013 as kind of when you start to see a bolder Russian presence in Syria, if that makes sense.
And for many of our listeners who probably aren't very well informed on the current state of politics and the regime in Syria, what is the sort of, I don't know if you could call it stalemate or the sort of status quo that is now being reinforced?
Yeah, it's it's concerning. I would say Syria is pretty much a de facto partitioned state with certain areas of the nation under the control of the Assad regime, certain areas that are under the control, mostly around Idlib, that are under the control of the rebel groups still. And there's some concern about that actually in light of the new developments in the Ukraine war. And then I would say other parts of Syria are under control of, pretty lawless groups and mafias and things like that. So it is a de facto, I would say, partitioned state that it is a locus of the international illegal trade. So you have an enormous trade in illegal drugs, weaponry, and other sorts of unsavory things going through Syria. And I would say actually that this is a pretty tolerable solution for the Russians and for the Assad regime in the sense that, there is no real significant challenge to their control and to their power. It's intolerable, of course, for the vast majority of Syrians. You have roughly, I want to say 22 million displaced Syrians, about more than half of the pre-war population.
Wow.
You've got hundreds of thousands of people missing, killed, forcibly disappeared. There's a 90% poverty rate in the country. I think several million. I think I want to say about 15 million dependent on aid. I can't remember if that's exactly right. So it's just it is not really a country anymore. I would say it's more sort of the Assad regime and the people that are, of course, unable to escape the Assad regime. It's really a pretty grim situation.
So how on earth could Vladimir Putin and Assad see this as success?
Well, it's success in that, again, there's no threat to them in this particular area. So although the United States has, resisted some of the tentative normalization of Assad that has gone on, we don't have the same level of commitment to our allies in Syria that Putin has to Assad, if that makes sense. There's a differential in terms of how much skin we have in the game. So there's just no. It's very hard to envision a situation in which the United States or other Western allies disrupts the current status quo, and the current status quo is that Putin and Assad are in control, and that is that's their vision of success.
And what does Putin gain from this?
I'm sure that there's a great deal of income generated for him and the oligarchs off of some of these illegal trades I mentioned. Okay. I'm sure also there is, as Zachary's question brought up, this broader vision of Russia as an imperial power and a sort of fulfilling its duties in terms of being a world power. So Assad is a very loyal ally to Putin. There's also, by the way, recently Putin has suggested that he would permit up to about, I want to say 40,000 Syrians to come fight in Ukraine. So I mentioned that 90% poverty rate, and that is forcing a lot of Syrians to come and fight in in Ukraine. And so there's only a few thousand now, but it's likely that there will be more, working with the Russian army and with the Wagner group and other mercenary groups. So you will see more Syrians coming to fight in Ukraine, I believe. So that is also a source, of course, of success for Putin, fortunately.
This is a grim story you're describing for us, but you're painting a picture of what is happening on the ground and has been happening for upwards of 7 years now, and it's important we recognize this, and it's something we need to grapple with in and of itself. Yeah. But it gains even greater urgency, I think, for citizens of the United States and other parts of the world who care about what's happening in Ukraine, because as both you and Zachary have said, in some ways this is a precursor to what we're seeing in Ukraine now and what we're likely to see in coming days and weeks. As you pointed out, Emily, General Alexander Dvornikov, who has been appointed recently by Putin as the commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, he is responsible for what you've just described. And so as an expert on Syria and the Middle East who has watched what you've described so closely, you were even there months ago, how do you view what you're seeing in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, as you point out, Dvornikov's appointment is very concerning. It coincided with an attack on a train station that targeted Ukrainian refugees. So it's a hint of, I think, that it's a suggestion that Putin and his generals are really going to play out the Syria playbook in Ukraine. So it's concerning and it's upsetting. And I think that you could see, again, a sort of tolerable solution for Russia in Ukraine would be something similar to Syria, where you have a de facto partition state with a weakened kind of rump state, perhaps under Zelensky's control in the West, but that Putin can sort of act with impunity in the East. I hope that I'm wrong. And I would say one thing that's different about Ukraine is that Syria did come before it, and that there is enormous people can recognize that. And although Syria often gets forgotten, the people who still pay attention to Syria, and quite a number of Syrians themselves, are actually reaching out to help to help citizens in Ukraine resist the Russian invasion and to fight against to Putin's forces. So there is some, although this looks very similar to Syria, there is, I have a little bit of hope that it will not play out in exactly the same way. There's also a much more robust international response this time around, which is, actually hopeful also for Syrians. A lot of Syrians are hopeful that if Russia is held to accountability for what it's done in Ukraine someday, that will set a precedent for Russia and for Putin and Assad to be held accountable for what has happened in Syria.
But so far, have you seen what looked to you as a historian as some of the same behaviors in Ukraine?
Yes, yeah. And I think you have to also remember that a lot of these are the same people. So there's an entire generation of Russian military officers who cut their teeth in Syria now. That's been going on for quite some time. And so they're enacting the same kind of practices, and they're approaching these battles in a similar way. The material difference, of course, is that you have a much stronger. You have things like artillery in Ukraine that you do not have in Syria. So there's a little bit more of the weight of the Russian army being unleashed in Ukraine that we didn't see quite so overtly in Syria. I don't know if that answers your question.
It certainly does, and of course, there's the Ukrainians are being far better armed.
Yes.
By external actors and by themselves than the Syrian resistance was. But I can't think of a better example, Emily, of why understanding, in this case, recent history is so important. What I hear you saying is that if we want to understand and anticipate Russian behavior, what we need to do is not think of Russia operating as a mirror image of our own militaries, which have their own problems, by the way.
Yes.
But instead as following a pattern of behavior and learned experience that reflects what you've described in Syria. Yes.
Yeah. And I would say that the international response is an important part of that. There was a significant international outcry as war crimes became revealed in Syria, but not much happened. And so you can see how someone watching that would assume that, okay, well, we're going to sort of unfold the same playbook in Ukraine, and that there won't be, and maybe there'll be an outcry, but there won't be much behind that. And so I think this is why it's of critical importance that the international system come together and really actually commit in a significant way to resisting the Russian push in Ukraine.
And so that leads naturally into my next question. What, based on your in-depth knowledge of the events in Syria, what do you think that those who are interested in helping the Ukrainians, maybe too late for the Syrians, but at least helping the Ukrainians, what lessons should we take for resistance to Russian brutality?
Yeah. And I would say, I hope that it's not too late for Syrians. There are still many Syrians who perhaps, they're perhaps not living in Syria at the moment, but that have really taken on the lead actually in helping Ukrainians with this. There's something called the Syria-Ukraine Network, which is led by a group of Syrians who are giving advice and best practice sharing and things like that to Ukrainians in Russia. Things like teaching them how to build underground hospitals to treat people who have been, people who have been injured and things like that. I think what we can do, our biggest lessons that we can sort of take away is that that words are very cheap. It sounds kind of trite, but that there's real, there's political posturing and then there's actually doing something. So this is a moment where real political courage is needed. I think the other lesson that I would take away from it would be, maybe more of a question. And the question I would ask is, what kind of international system do we want to have? And to me, that really comes down to, we can kind of, I think that a lot of times American foreign policy is very reactive. We're interested in preserving a status quo in which the United States is powerful. And we view any change to that status quo as a potential threat to American power. And I think that this is a moment where the status quo is changing already. The status quo is, has changed. We will not be able to turn back the clock to get back to what Syria was in 2010. We will not be able to turn back the clock to get to what Ukraine was last year, even. So then the question becomes, what kind of international system do we want to live in now, and how do we best how do we make that system, and what do we do actively to make that system work? Yeah, that's what I would say.
What about? I think you hinted at this a little bit, but what about the parallels between the sort of diasporic communities that we're seeing now of Ukrainians, particularly in Poland and in other parts of Eastern Europe? I mean, it's hard not to notice the irony that the Ukrainian refugees who are being welcomed in Poland today are in many ways coming the same route and coming from the same violence as Syrian refugees who were turned back 10 years before.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would actually, there were actually stories of Syrian refugees who have lived in, Romania and Poland, and who came to the borders actually to help welcome Ukrainian refugees. So even these people who have, for the most part, been kind of abandoned by Europe are still really, they see solidarity with Ukrainians. And yeah, it is, it's a reminder that the problem of refugees, a lot of people were saying this during the Syrian war, and that, refugees are, it's not a feature of a particular region of the world. Although we have seen more Middle Eastern refugees in recent years, that it doesn't take much for refugees to exist, to originate from outside the Middle East. And you're seeing that now in Ukraine. Obviously, Ukrainian refugees are getting a much warmer welcome, and it's frustrating. But you have to also keep in mind the broader context that I think the way that things get covered in the media, we were still learning in 2015 and 2016 really about what disinformation and fake news and things like that were capable of, how they were capable of shaping the media coverage. So, I don't want to give people a pass, but I think I'm hesitant to say, I think that we should be welcoming refugees, whether they're Syrian or Ukrainian. And I think at least there's a little bit of a conversation started about that. Other people are noticing, okay, there's a big difference in the way that these Ukrainian refugees are treated and the Syrian refugees are treated. So while the response is not perfect, there's at least a conversation going on. So my hope is that in the future, we'll be a little more consistent.
That's a very sensible perspective, and it's terrible to see, and it's a topic we talk about quite often on this podcast. It's terrible to see how racial prejudice continues to influence the way people make judgments about life and death, quite frankly. But it is also heartening to see Ukrainian refugees being welcomed, and it is heartening to see that at least there's a conversation beginning, as you say, about the disjunction between the way we treated Syrian refugees and now Ukrainian refugees. Emily, coming back to where we were a second ago, as you know, we like to always close on an optimistic note, and this is a very grim story we're discussing tonight, but there is the opportunity for our democracy, and I mean broadly American democracy, European democracy, democracies in various parts of the world. There's an opportunity for democracy to learn from the tragedy of recent years, learn from the mistakes of the past. That's one of the strengths and possibilities of democracy. What is it that we should have learned from Syria when we think about Russia today? I know you are a critic, appropriately and compellingly, of the excessive use of American force and the American frequent refrain that we will save the world by imposing ourselves upon it. So the last thing I know you would argue for would be an American-led military intervention to correct the wrongs of Russia. Nonetheless, you clearly think we need to do certain things, and we are a society, and our allies have capabilities, as our society does. So what should we do? And in particular, what should our listeners be encouraging our society and fellow democracies to do in this grim moment, as you've described it?
Yeah, well, you, I think, accurately assessed the uncomfortable position I put myself in, where I don't think that, I think that there's there's military intervention and there's military intervention. I think there's a way to intervene or contribute to the war effort in Ukraine without coming in with the full weight of the American military and sort of imposing an American envisioned solution. So I think the first thing that we need to do is listen to Ukrainians, listen to what they need from us from a material standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, and then try to give that to them. It sounds very simple, but this was something that was, I was in Jordan in 2013 when there was a real possibility of American involvement in the Syrian war, and people were very agonized in Jordan about whether or not the United States should intervene militarily, because their memory, of course, of the Afghanistan and the Iraq wars was so fresh. At the same time, there's a long scale of involvement and of real commitment that goes, there's a wide spectrum. That's kind of what the word I'm looking for. A wide spectrum from, saying a bunch of things and not doing anything to full bore invasion like we saw in Iraq in 2003. And far be it from me to say what the right thing to do is, but I think the first step has always got to be listen to the people who are suffering right now and take them at their word for what they actually need from us. And I think, what I would say for people to encourage their representatives to do and to think about in terms of response, that's a tough question. I think, again, Zach had a very astute question at the beginning, where I think that I've been thinking often of the parallels to the Spanish Civil War, and that was a real moment for the international system to understand what was coming. And I think we need to understand that Ukraine is not an exception. Syria is not an exception. These are indicators of a one man's very dangerous worldview. And I think we need to think very long and hard about what we do with that.
Zachary, I know you've been struggling over this. You've actually been emotionally touched, as many of us have, and I think as many of your contemporaries have, Zachary, and your poem reflected that. What do you think we should be doing? And has Emily's discussion of listening to the Ukrainians, does that give you a way to think about this?
I think so. I think it's easy to either forget about Ukraine now after the sort of outpouring of emotional support from Americans, the sort of Ukrainian flags that you still see all over the country. I think it's easy after a month of doing that to forget or to focus on other things. But at the same time, it's also easy to become sort of to desensitize to what's going on and forget the actual human suffering involved. So I think we do have to listen. We have to make sure we're in tune with the actual human suffering that is going on the ground on a daily basis. And we also have to be aware that it's not going to be contained to Ukraine simply by virtue of us being thousands of miles away. It affects us every time the laws and norms of international behavior are broken in such an egregious way.
Right, right. Well, I think this discussion has opened so many avenues for understanding and empathy, and at the very least, rethinking some of our assumptions. Emily and Zachary, I think you both shared with us ways in which we should recognize that there are no easy solutions, that there are patterns of behavior that are very difficult to break, very difficult to stop, and that maybe the best we can do is to at least start by forcing ourselves to understand and open our eyes and see what's happening, that there's a humanity in recognizing, acknowledging, and trying to respond by listening to those on the ground who are suffering in this way. And I think your perspective, Emily, I don't think it offers any easy solutions, but it at least humanizes the conflict. And I think that's important. I think that's part of your aim, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I actually would say, I think what you said, there are no easy solutions. That is something that we can do as individuals every day, is really resist the easy story, resist the easy narrative, if that makes sense, the simple narrative. And when we see simple narratives, be a little skeptical towards it. And that will, I think, go a long way towards sort of opening our minds to what comes next.
Right. Simple narratives of forgetting, as Zachary said, or simple narratives of our own self-righteousness, both of which we need to work our way past. So I want to do something now to close that we don't often do, but I think Zachary's poem was so powerful and so appropriate, Emily, for so many of the really thoughtful, uniquely informed insights that you shared with us. Zachary, I want to ask you to read the last 4 lines, the end of your poem, one more time to close us out, if you would.
Where is it that the killers learn to kill so cold? In the streets of your city, they have overturned the stones. They have opened all the sewers just outside your door. And here, in our town, we're already buried because we've seen it all before.
And Emily, I want to give you the last words to close us out.
Yeah. Zach, I just thought of, as you're reading the last bit of your poem, of another poem written by a great Lebanese poet, Etel Adnan. And she wrote it, and the title is "It Was Beirut All Over Again." And she wrote it thinking about the conflict in El Salvador in the 1980s and how it reminded her of the war that was still ongoing in Beirut at the time. So I think that that's a good reminder that these things do not stop at borders.
Right. And we study history, so at least we give ourselves the opportunity to learn and not just revisit the same tragedy again and again as if it's something we're not prepared for, right?
Absolutely.
Emily, thank you so much. I want to again encourage our listeners to look up the voluminous work of Emily Whalen. She is really writing some of the most interesting work on the Middle East today and its relevance for the larger international community. And she will be writing a lot more, I know, so everyone can keep an eye out for her work. And of course, I want to thank our podcast poet and co-producer, Zachary Suri. And most of all, I want to thank our listeners for joining us each week and for continuing to remain faithful to the aspirations of democracy, or what Franklin Roosevelt called the next chapter that we are all writing right now. Thank you for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.